Welcome, everyone. This is, if you can believe it, the 23rd Goodman Lecture presented by Kensei Foundation. My name is Trent Walker. I'm a member of Kensei Foundation Academic Development Committee. I'm also a faculty member in Buddhist Studies at the University of Michigan. Today, as you all know, we are delighted that we have a chance to hear a talk by Professor Albert Welter, a prolific scholar of Chinese and also Japanese Buddhism. His lecture is titled In Search of Zen Studies, the Central Role of Zen Syncretism. Let me just say a little bit about this series in general for those of you that might be joining us for the first time, and then I'll say a few words about our distinguished speaker. The Goodman Lectures are an online series that's really designed to build bridges between academic and general audiences interested in Buddhist studies. And part of why we do this here at Kensei Foundation is to highlight the many incredible scholars and programs in Buddhist studies across the world that we have the good fortune of being able to partner with. And one of those, of course, is the University of Arizona. This lecture, as well as all 22 past talks, are made freely available from Kensei Foundation online and in our social media channels. The Goodman Lectures are inspired by a longtime friend and advisor of Kensei Foundation, that is Professor Stephen Goodman, who sadly passed away in 2020. Our series really tries to reflect Stephen's enduring vision of making academic talks like these that are sponsored by the Foundation available to all. Kensei Foundation, established by Tsongsar Kensei Rinpoche, has been supporting Buddhist study and practice since 2001, including through grants, scholarships, and other collaborations. For more info, as always, please visit us at www.kenseifoundation.org. As usual, for these events, we'll have a period of discussion after the talk. And as I mentioned before, the way to ask a question to the speaker is to submit it via chat to KF Q&A in the chat box via Zoom. And then I will pose selected questions that you all submit to our speaker. So our speaker today, Professor Albert Welter, is, in my mind, one of the most influential scholars of East Asian Buddhism working today. His many books and articles cover a wide range of topics, but with a particular specialization on the study of Chinese Buddhism, including the transition from the late Tang to the Song dynasty, from the roughly the 9th through the 13th centuries, this broader period in which much of his work has been centered. He's also published in the area of Japanese Buddhism, which is, of course, quite related to what we will hear from him today. Professor Welter's research also showcases his broader interest, which is quite, I think, distinct within the broader field of Buddhist studies in Chinese administrative and state policies toward Buddhism, including Chinese notions of secularism and their impact on religious beliefs and practices. From our perspective here at Kensei Foundation, one of the most exciting projects that he is currently involved in is the Hangzhou Region Buddhist Culture Project. This is sponsored by Kensei Foundation in conjunction with Zhejiang University, the Hangzhou Academy of Social Sciences, and the Hangzhou Buddhist Academy. In terms of some of the published writings that have been quite important coming out of Professor Welter's work recently. One can think of his recent monograph, A Tale of Two Stupas, History of Hangzhou Relic Veneration Through Two of Its Most Enduring Monuments. This came out in 2022 from Oxford University Press. And then thinking just back to the beginning of this year, another one of his books came out this time through SUNY Press titled The Future of China's Past, Reflections on the Meaning of China's Rise, which looks at the way that different Chinese philosophical and also religious traditions such as Buddhism, legalism, Taoism, Confucianism, and more have been reimagined for political and other kinds of purposes. Previous volumes of his work have examined social and administrative histories of Chan Buddhism through the Tang and Song periods, as I mentioned, the doctrinal ideas of an important Chan master of this period named Yongming Yanshou, and also the place of religion in the public sphere in both China and Japan. Something that's been particularly inspiring for me is the way that Professor Welter has been a really active organizer of projects that support international collaborations across several different continents on the study of Buddhism. And for these kinds of events, he's received funding from the American Council of Learning Societies, also with the support of the Jiang Jingguo Foundation for an International Conference. For instance, one called Creating the World of Tang-Tokugawa Zen, Chinese Chan Buddhism and its spread through East Asia. Finally, before coming to the University of Arizona, where he now teaches and conducts his research, Dr. Welter was based in Canada, where his projects were regularly supported by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. So now, without any further ado, I want you all to please join me in welcoming Professor Welter. We're really delighted that you have a chance, that we have a chance to listen to you speak on this topic today. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Trent. That was such a wonderful introduction. You made me think like, oh, I'd really like to meet this guy. But thank you so much. And I'm glad you mentioned the Kinsey Foundation and their support for the projects that I've been doing and we've been doing at the University of Arizona, in particularly the Hangzhou project, which is very much underneath of what I'm going to talk about today. And particularly, I want to make note of the fact that the Kinsey Foundation supported a workshop in Kyoto, Japan last summer in May, international. We had students from all over the world, speakers from all over the world, partnering with the Japanese Buddhist experts to present this workshop, which is very much a kind of a Japanese extension of the Hangzhou project. Because for those of people who may be are knowledgeable about Chinese Buddhism, Hangzhou, of course, is a very important region for Buddhism, but it was also very important for the spread of Buddhism throughout other regions of East Asia, particularly in Japan. And that's actually one of the kind of a segue into one of the things that I'm going to be focusing on today. And the topic is to look at Zen studies in the trajectory of how it developed in Japan and its background. But I'm going to start, if I may, by trying to share my screen. This may take me just a moment, and we'll see how we do here. How are we doing? Is everybody can see?
Yes, it looks great. We're seeing your slides, and hopefully you have the right view for you.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Thank you. Okay, so I'll get right into it. I'm going to start by reviewing the abstract that I gave for this talk, and in some ways, this talk is a little bit autobiographical because I was I was trained in quote unquote Zen studies. I was trained in Japan, although my own work took a somewhat different direction than kind of at least what was then as the mainstream of Zen studies. And that's one of the things that I want to talk about today. But for those of you who are knowledgeable about Zen studies, you'll understand that Zen studies had a huge impact throughout much of the 20th century. And as a result of that, it became an academic discipline. But Zen studies was very much looked upon this tradition, the Chinese Chan tradition, Korean Song tradition, was very much looked at through the lens of Japanese Zen. And it was rooted in Japan's reaction to events in the modern world. So when Zen incorporated a broad range of Zen-related movements throughout the Asian world, it did very much through a Japanese lens. It was very much rooted in a Japanese context and aspects of the Zen experience that did not fit aspirations framed by modern Rinzai Zen orthodoxy tended to be marginalized and ignored. Now, toward the end of the 20th century, 30, 40 years ago now, many scholars in this area started to question some of the presumptions of the academic study of Zen Buddhism, what they were founded on. And what I want to do today is I want to go back and I want to look to begin to kind of retrace the origins of how Zen studies started as an academic discipline. So I'm going to look next at the outline of topics that I'm going to present today. So not only am I going to look at the origins of Zen studies, but I think to properly understand the origins of Zen studies, we have to look at the origins of Buddhist studies, and particularly the environment that it came out of in 19th century Europe. So I'm going to start with a kind of a review of that, and then I'm going to turn briefly to the Japanese orientations and look at Japan's modernization and how Buddhist studies in Japan developed in the wake of that. And then I'm going to look at really the foundations of Zen studies through the famous promoter of Zen in the West, D.T. Suzuki, who really provided the rise of an international Zen consciousness. And I'll look at this in the context of not only did he begin Zen studies, but he also began the studies of Mahayana Buddhism, because up until that time, the focus had been very much on Indian Buddhism, and particularly, what we, the Shravaka tradition, we might say, what we now call the Theravada tradition. And I'm also going to look at this rise of Zen consciousness in terms of the paradigm of pure Zen. And then I'll look briefly at Yanagita Seizan and the golden age of Zen studies in the latter part of the 20th century. And then I'm going to spend most of the time looking on the main theme of my talk today, this what I consider the overlooked tradition of Chan Zen syncretism, this kind of syncretic or combined practice Zen, which in many ways I'm going to argue is the core of the tradition rather than the pure Zen tradition as it was introduced to the West. But anyway, let me start with the European discovery of Buddhism. Buddhism was discovered in the West in the first half of the 19th century and began to have great impact later in that century. On the popular front, one can look to Sir Edwin Arnold's The Light of Asia, which depicts the life, character, and philosophy of Prince Gautama, the founder of Buddhism, and was subsequently translated into numerous languages, including Hindi. So in other words, this work done by late 19th century Englishmen had such a profound impact that it sort of reintroduced the Buddha to his home country. And of course, it was translated into many languages throughout the world. And in fact, Edwin Arnold, you could say, became Sir on the basis of this book. It was of great magnitude, its popularity. On the scholarly front, there was the legendary Max Mueller, whose 50-volume series on the sacred books of the East included many Buddhist classics translated in English for the first time. Hermann Oldenburg, a German academic, wrote a groundbreaking study, the Buddha, Sein Leben, Sein Lehre, Sein Gemeinde, the Buddha, his life, his doctrine, his order, that spurred academic interest and had a great impact at that time. So, but as we know, all transitional moments in the history of ideas, the discovery of Buddhism by Europeans is no different. It came with a particular view of the world that emanated from its European provenance. And this, in academic circles, has been characterized as Protestant Buddhism. And I want to look, just briefly at this term Protestant Buddhism, because it originally was associated with the Sri Lankan Anagarika Dharmapala, the leader of a protest or revival movement. He promoted a vision of Buddhism as a religion compatible with science and Western values, such as democracy. So it's kind of a kind of Buddhist beginning of a Buddhist modernism. But in academic circles, this term really took hold through the work of Gregory Chopin, who wrote an influential article in 1991, Archaeology and Protestant Presuppositions in the Study of Indian Buddhism, and revealed the Protestant presuppositions of European discoverers of Buddhism. He concludes that it is possible that these presuppositions have determined our characterization of the history of Indian Buddhism, and that this characterization reflects more Protestant history and values than Indian Buddhist history and values. So just to continue along with this, when I did some research, I realized that actually Chopin was not the first kind of modern academic to reveal this association, that David Snellgrove, a great scholar of Indian and Tibetan Buddhism, he wrote a response to Oldenburg and his influence. And this is Snellgrove writing in 1973, so almost a century after Oldenburg wrote his work. And he made explicit the problems associated with the Protestant-inspired quest for the historical Buddha. In response to Oldenburg, he said that Oldenburg created a figure of the historical Buddha, which has been now popularly accepted by Westerners and by Westernized Asians, cast in the mold of European 19th century liberal and rational thought, bearing on examination no relationship to the religious aspirations and conceptions relating to Shakyamuni Buddha, as revealed in the earliest Buddhist literature. And he goes on to state that this quest of the historical Buddha began as a Western 19th century interest, imitating both in its presuppositions and its methods of inquiry the parallel quest of the historical Jesus of Nazareth. So I want to, next, I just want to kind of look briefly at this parallel quest in more detail, so that in line with the Protestant Christian presuppositions, the field of Buddhist studies has been plagued with these Protestant overtones from its inceptions. Shakyamuni was likened to Jesus Christ as the origin of Buddhism. The dialogues of the Buddha, like the Christian New Testament, a kind of good news for humankind. This next point, I think, maybe is the most important one, at least in my mind, that the subsequent Buddhist developments were looked upon as a perversion of the original message of the Buddha, much like the Catholic tradition was looked upon by the Protestants as a perversion of true Christianity. What did that mean in practice? It meant that all of the Asian voices, Buddhist voices, throughout history, were sidelined. Because they had supposedly deviated from this new vision of the Shakyamuni as the originator of Buddhism in the conceptions of 19th century European Buddhologists. Now, it's no small accident, I think, that in Buddhism in India at that time, there was, I won't say there was no Buddhist tradition, but there was not much of a Buddhist tradition, and hadn't been for almost 1,000 years. So that, in India, the early Buddhologists, European Buddhologists, had a kind of blank slate in which they could write their aspirations for Buddhism onto, and this greatly influenced how we think of modern Buddhism. And on the one hand, I'm taking a rather critical perspective here, but on the other hand, we have to acknowledge, I think, that the great success that they enjoyed, as many kind of intellectual movements, even though we can, in retrospect, maybe think we can understand and outline and underscore their presuppositions, their biases, if you will, but we can't deny the impact that they had in their wake and that they continue to have. So this quest for the original true teachings of historical Buddhism, true Buddhism, was very much like the Protestant quest for the historical Jesus and true Christianity. Now, the further thing I want to, when we discuss the term modern or modernity, at least in my mind, it invokes the spirit of Max Weber. And Weber's formulation in this regard casts a long shadow over our understanding of modernity and its relation to tradition, especially religion, and the West's alleged uniqueness over the non-West. Weber's formulation of modernity derives from the European Enlightenment, notions of rationality and subjective freedom that grew out of Protestant Christianity, and the rejection of the traditional Christianity that preceded it. It essentially negates everything that is non-modern. The past, and in this case, medieval Europe, and the other, which really refers to Asia. By necessity, Asia and medieval Europe are lumped together as lacking rationality and subjective freedom, the essential components of Weber's modernity. In the Weberian project, the key components of modernity were products of Christian civilization, universalized as truth, applicable to all times, all societies, and all civilizations. It is easy, I think, to extrapolate how the European discovery of Buddhism was inspired by the impulse to imagine a Buddhism as a religion that fit the Weberian notions of rationality and subjective freedom, or fit, if not surpass them, equaling, if not surpassing the supreme form of religion that Protestantism represented. But how does this relate to Zen studies? So when we go to Zen studies, we have to think about the modernization of Japan. And this relates to the Meiji period. Emperor Meiji here depicted in his traditional form and then his modernized form on the right. This is the transition, the great transition from the Tokugawa to the Meiji period. And I think we need to remember, and it's easy because so many non-Western countries have subsequently followed in Japan's wake at modernization, that Japan was the first non-Western country to break the mold, to modernize on the Western model. This had tremendous impact. Of course, it had tremendous impact in Japan, but it had tremendous impact in Asia and in the other parts of the world, and we are still in the wake of that impact as it continues. Now, if I want to encapsulate the formula for the success of that, I look at the Japanese samurai intellectual of the late 19th century, Sakuma Shozan, who came up with this formula of Eastern ethics and Western technology, Toyo Dotoku Seiyo Gakuge. And by Eastern ethics, in other words, in the face of this colonial and in the face of colonization and Western military and technological superiority, Sakuma Shozan, came up, he said, well, if we want to compete and defeat this, we need to adopt the technology, Western technology. But, however, and this is maybe kind of the secret weapon, we have our own moral spirit, our own ethical spirit. And if we can adapt Western technology, combine it with our superior moral spirit, we will reign supreme. We will be able to combat this the forces of this technological and cultural onslaught coming from the West. So Zen, in a sense, became this was the kind of the formulation of the ideology in Meiji Japan of how to deal with this situation. Buddhism had trouble adapting in that context because Buddhism, happens in many places where modernization hits, one of the immediate impulses is to think of Buddhism relates to tradition. It's part of the problem, not part of the solution. It's the repository of superstition and outmoded ideas. So Zen successfully combated that internally to promote itself as a unique form of the Japanese spirit, or a key component of Eastern ethics. And therefore, Japan had something not only positioned to uniquely offer in the Japanese context, but also to could be held up to the world as something unique and superior. The important thing here is when as Japan modernized, it created the modern academy, the modern university system, both the public universities in Japan, like Tokyo University, Kyoto University, Hokkaido University, and so on. I think 7 in total became the kind of the crown jewels of the Japanese university system. But also they formulated private universities. Some of these are very famous, Waseda University, Keio University, etc. But also, as I'm going to talk about in a second, it also stimulated the transformation of Buddhist institutions, doctrinal institutions, into modern private Buddhist sectarian universities. So this had a major impact in Japan and the creation of its academic system. But how did the European inspirations for the creation of Buddhist studies, how did they impact Japan? So the impact of early Buddhist studies in Japan, I think we can look at the 2 modes, as I was alluding to before. There's one that comes from the Japanese imperial universities, and the Japanese imperial universities were very much predicated on Western university models, particularly European, and at that time, particularly German university models. And so when they went to and saw what was going on at European universities, I suppose you can say, of course, they were interested in what was going on in Buddhist studies. They were a Buddhist country. They had this strong historical Buddhist foundations were important to Japan. So what they found was this focus on Indian Buddhism, on Pali and Sanskrit. So at the major Japanese imperial universities who very much followed that model, their students at the major universities very much followed the European model. So I point here Nanjo Bunyu, who studied Sanskrit in Indian philosophy from European scholars, including Max Muller, and Takakusu Junjiro, who studied Sanskrit at Oxford and continued studies in France and Germany. So this represents one model, and I can say that this is a model that continues down to the present day. That Japanese imperial universities, when they do Buddhist studies, they tend to fixate on this style that they inherited from their European predecessors. And they formed the Japanese Association of Indo-Buddhist Studies, the Nihon Indo-Gaku Bukkyo Gakkai, which still is in existence today. They have a famous journal where Japanese Buddhist scholarship occurs. So this is a tradition that was formulated in the late 19th century upon this European model of Buddhist studies. But the second impact was on the Japanese Buddhist sectarian universities, as I mentioned before, that, of course, these institutions all had training centers for their clergy. The Shinshu, Pure Land, the Jodo Shinshu, the Rinzai Zen, Soto Zen, Nichiren, and so on. They all had these training institutions. So they formulated a Buddhist studies model, and in their traditions, their traditions were all tended to be much more East Asian focused. Their own traditions, they traced their origins back to China, more so than they did to India. So this became, they didn't ignore the trend of Buddhist studies at the imperial universities, the European model, but they also adopted a sectarian university model for the study of Japanese Buddhism, which was much more East Asian focused. And I would, I have to say though that when Chinese Buddhism was incorporated, which it was always as a prelude to Japanese Buddhism, how it led to Japanese Buddhism. So Chinese Buddhism was, in some sense, hardly ever subjected to a study unto itself in its own right. It was always in the service of the Japanese Buddhist sectarian tradition. So again, how does this relate to the growth of Zen studies? And here we get to the response of D.T. Suzuki. The spell cast by the European fascination with Indian, especially early Indian Buddhism, was broken in the early 20th century through the writings of D.T. Suzuki. Suzuki is well known as a proselytizer of Zen Buddhism in the West. He carved out a space for Zen as a legitimate expression of Buddhism beyond the Indian cultural sphere. The victory he won, however, was a mixed one, as he did so with an interpretation of Zen that attempted to transcend the Protestant presuppositions that the discipline of Buddhist studies assumed, cast as Snellgrove suggested, in the mode of European 19th century liberal and rational thought. Now, many scholars have written about D.T. Suzuki, and they've written, and as influential he was in the kind of the beginning and mid 20th century, by the late 20th century, he began to undergo criticism. Partly, this criticism is reflected in some sense in my talk. But I think we have to underscore that Suzuki, he did something that was quite impactful in the sense that he broke and as I mentioned, he broke the fascination with Indian Buddhism as quote unquote the only form of true Buddhism. All of a sudden, Zen Buddhism kind of entered the picture as something that captured not only the public's imagination, popular imagination, but also scholarly imagination. And as my colleague at University of Tokyo, Norihisa Baba, he was the one who talked about Suzuki's impact. Because I always talked about it in terms of Zen Buddhism, but he said, no, really what he did is he created a space through his teacher, Shaku Soen, introduced at the World Parliament of Religions in Chicago. He created a space for the first time for Mahayana Buddhism as a legitimate expression of Buddhism. So in that sense, we have to credit Suzuki. Again, it's sort of going back, we criticize certain kind of biases, but we also have to recognize the great impact that he had as a result of his work. So how did Zen studies as an academic discipline begin? And it began in Japan with the study group of the American benefactress, Ruth Fuller Sasaki, a student of D.T. Suzuki and a principal supporter of the Buddhist Society of America in New York. And along with her was the Zen master Miura Ishu. Prominent students included Yanagita Seizan, the illustrious Japanese Zen scholar who produced many, many groundbreaking works on Zen studies in the late 20th century. Also, Philip Yampolsky, his book, The Platform Sutra of the Sixth Patriarch, published in 1967, set the field of American and Western Zen studies in a more scholarly direction based on his research with this group, with Sasaki Zen group of study in Japan. And also included, interestingly, I want to point out, was Gary Snyder of the Beat Poet generation that symbolized the influence of Zen on the American counterculture of the 50s and 60s. So this academic group in Kyoto was quite influential, born out of a kind of interesting mixture of, Japanese aspirations following, well, in this case, following the Second World War, and then also the American aspirations that were growing in the kind of counterculture movement. So I look at the golden age of Zen through the eyes of Yanagita Seizan, being one of the most important Japanese Buddhologists in the 20th century. Unfortunately, there's not much of his work that's translated into English, but those of us who study the things, anything to do with Chinese Chan or Japanese Zen, are very familiar with Yanagita's work. From 1960, he taught as a professor at the Institute for Buddhist Studies at Hanazono University in Kyoto. Hanazono is the kind of the academic branch of the Rinzai school in Japan. After his retirement in 1986, he founded the International Research Institute for Zen Buddhism that became an important research institution for many Western scholars. And the generation of American Western scholars who traveled to Japan to study under him constitutes a kind of who's who of Zen scholars. The photo that I have here, it depicts him at Stanford University in 1989. It includes William Powell, who's at the University of California, Santa Barbara, Carl Bielefeld at Stanford, Bernard Farr, who was at Stanford and later went to Columbia, Richard Lynn, University of Toronto, Rob Gemello, University of Arizona, my own institution, and later at Harvard, Philip Yampolsky, who I mentioned from Columbia, Peter Gregory at the University of Illinois, and Urs Opp at the International Research Institute for Zen Studies in Kyoto, Robert Buswell at UCLA, Griff Folk, very important contributor to modern Zen studies at Sarah Lawrence, and the late John McCrae, who was at the University of Indiana. Okay, so this represents the kind of the maturation of Zen studies. The fascination between correcting the history of early Chan through the Dunhuang manuscripts and the suppositions of pure Zen. So the early fascination, the fascination of Yanagita and many people was to kind of rewrite the history of the early Chan tradition through the discovery of the Dunhuang manuscript, which had brought to light many, many important developments that had been erased from the historical record. So they did make great progress there. But the tradition of Chan or Zen syncretism was largely overlooked. Did not capture their attention. They were very much in the earlier tradition, not in the sort of what we might call the classical Chan or classical Zen tradition. You know, which was still under the influence of this notion of pure Zen that D.T. Suzuki had introduced. In fact, there is no pure Zen. There was only the imagination of it. And Suzuki Zen and Rinzai Zen orthodox in the 20th century is an imagined construct that doesn't square with the reality of Zen practice. This is one of the things that really came out in the late 20th century through many scholars began to question the suppositions that Suzuki had brought to the idea of Zen, and which cast a large shadow over Zen studies. So there we see that then there's a dichotomy between the rhetorical, what is often called rhetorical Zen, which is imaginary, versus the institutional Zen practice, the reality of what people actually do in Zen. And one way of looking at this, understanding the dichotomy, is through the 4 slogans of Zen teaching. Okay, the irony is apparent in the artwork depicted here on the postcard on the right here, which hangs on my office door. Buli wansu Jiawai Biechuan, or Furitsu Moji Kyogai Betsuden in Japanese. It means no dependence on words and letters, a special transmission outside the teaching, which are the first 2 slogans here. They're written here at the top of the card. But on the main focus of the card is the Zen monk is depicted depending on the very teaching the slogan decries, and being very dependent on the words and letters the teaching is communicated through. And this is the kind of irony that I think is kind of at the heart of the way that the Zen tradition is imagined and the reality behind it. Of course, it's meant to be a humorous depiction of the dichotomy. But in my own research, I've shown that individually the slogans are found in works dating before the Song dynasty, but they do not appear together as a four-part series of expressions until well into the Song, when they're attributed to Bodhidharma in a collection of recorded sayings compiled in early 12th century. Three of the slogans do not establish words and letters, directly point to the human mind, see one's nature and become a Buddha, were all established as normative Chan teachings by the beginning of the Song dynasty. So that's like the beginning, like the late 9th, early 10th century. Oh no, sorry, late 10th, early 11th century. The fourth slogan, a special transmission outside the teachings, appeared later, and its status as an interpretation of the true meaning of do not establish words and letters was the subject of great controversy throughout the Song dynasty and beyond. Now, I guess in a sense, what I'm saying is that traditions are complicated. They don't always speak with a uniform voice and a uniform position. And this is what has been lost in the modern depiction of Zen as a pure Zen tradition, as this pure Zen is the only and the true tradition. This is an interpretation. If the historical facts, the historical situation depicts a different reality. And that's what I would like to spend much of the rest of my time trying to unravel. So first of all, if we look for a pre-modern term for pure Zen, we're not going to find it. There is no term. This is a term of modern coinage. The slogan, a special transmission outside the teachings, the Kyogei Betsuden, served as the precursor to a pure Zen exclusive to Buddhist teachings. The idea that a special transmission outside the teachings means that Zen is something that is at least superior, if not something that jettisons the rest of the Buddhist teachings. So the rest of the Buddhist teachings, in other words, the whole Buddhist canon is, in some sense, inconsequential. It's only this pure Zen tradition, pure Zen transmission, that is what constitutes the true message of Zen and the true message of Buddhism. So this became the kind of controversy as to how to understand this slogan. And in fact, it wasn't accepted by everybody, as we'll see. So this sets up this contrast between pure Zen and what I call syncretic Zen, or in other words, rhetorical Zen versus institutional Zen. I might call outsider Zen versus establishment Zen. When I say outsider Zen, it's because during the way the tradition depicts itself and is depicted, and in some sense the reality, the historical reality, during the Tang dynasty, Chan was not the mainstream Buddhist tradition in China. Far from it. That only occurred through the Tang-Song transition, and during the Song dynasty, it acquired this kind of special role, almost an establishment Buddhism kind of profile in the Song dynasty. During the Tang, they were outsiders. And also in the Tokugawa period, from 1600 onwards through 1868, 1603, 1868, during that period, for the first time in Japanese history since the adoption of Chinese Buddhist culture, going way back to the Nara period, through the Heian, through the Kamakura, up until the Tokugawa. Up until that time, it was always a form of Buddhism that the ruling elite turned to as an expression of the moral teaching of the country. And that was very important in the Kamakura period. It was Zen, following the Song model, which I'll talk about in a moment. But so in the Tokugawa period, like during the Tang, the Zen Buddhists were relegated to being outsiders. They were no longer part of the establishment. And I look at the Hakuin Eikaku is the Tokugawa figure who is often looked to as the principal example of the pure Zen tradition. And I'm contrasting here with the Eisai, who I'll talk about more in a second, but is very much in the syncretic Zen mode. But if you look at the depiction of them, you see the caricature of the Zen master almost making fun of the institution that they're embodying, as opposed to the more regal depiction of Eisai on the right-hand side, which is very typical of the depiction of abbots during this period, not only in Japan, but also in Song Dynasty China. And these are kind of major institutional figures who have a principal role, not only in their monastery, but throughout society as a whole. So I want to look at this Tang-Tokugawa alliance, at least in brief, this tradition of outsiders. So if I look at the Tang Dynasty and the ascension, I would say, of the Linji tradition in China, I often point to the publication of the Sijia Yulu, the dialogue records of the four houses, because these are Matsu Dawi, Baizhang Huaihai, Huangbo Shiyuan, and Linji Yishun, who becomes the patriarch whose lineage bears his name. And these, in the early Song Dynasty, these were this collection was formed, and it was kind of like the consolidation of what we call classical Linji Chan tradition. And of course, then this is the tradition that was inherited by Hakuin in the I just spoke about in the Edo period, the Tokugawa period, and then later D.T. Suzuki is kind of the heir of this tradition, of this special transmission outside the teaching tradition that represents this kind of rhetorical Chan or Zen positioning. If we look at the Song-Kamakura continuum, and I look at Eisai, we see the important role that he had in the transformation of Japanese Buddhist culture, aligning it with the new Buddhism of the Song dynasty. So Eisai spent considerable time in the Hangzhou region of China, and is credited with the first authorized transmission of Zen to Japan. But Eisai was very much an expert. He very much a product of his time, of the Tendai Mikyo practice known as Taimitsu, and the Kenmitsu, or esoteric Buddhist orthodoxy that prevailed throughout Japan during the medieval period. So he did not see Zen as something that was opposed to these things, but something that accentuated or maybe even fulfilled the tradition. So Zen for him was not a special transmission outside the teaching. There was nothing separate about it for him, but it was also, you might say, it was a fulfillment of the teaching. And the conventional Buddhist teaching and practice were very much a part of this tradition that Zen embodied. Now, in terms of the establishment Buddhism, we look at the Gozan or the Five Mountains monastery system in Japan. You know, it was this is something that was embraced by the Kamakura Bakufu, the Kamakura samurai leaders. When they sought to enhance their cultural reputations against the imperial and aristocratic critics who saw the new warrior ruling class as culturally deficient. So the samurai, feeling culturally deficient, they latched onto this new form of Buddhism coming out of Song China, and they embraced it. And this became, in the end, this kind of helped dissolve the kind of cultural and class tensions between the two groups, as both groups found solace in these shared cultural norms. And this is, you know, a very famous system in Japan, but it actually started in Song Dynasty, Southern Song Dynasty, China, the Five Mountain system there, which, so when Eisai went to, and his contemporaries experienced the new Buddhist cultural world of the Southern Song Dynasty, they experienced it through the unique system of institutionalized Buddhist culture that was present in these in this kind of monastic system, which was very much part of the establishment and supported by the central government of its times. You know, so the modern disestablishment, just as take Eisai again for a moment, that Yanagita is embarrassed by Eisai when he writes about Eisai. That, you know, he writes about Eisai's major work, Promoting Zen for Protecting the Country, is nothing more than nationalistic propaganda. And you have to remember that Yanagita is writing in the aftermath of the impact of the Second World War in Japan. And so a kind of nationalistic Buddhism the idea doesn't resonate at all with intellectuals like Yanagita. And that his work hardly has any appeal when compared with works by Dogen or Shinran. These are two other major figures of the Kamakura Buddhist period. And he talks about how Eisai is, you know, he seeks robes and titles of recognition. He became a clerical functionary for the Kamakura Bakufu, the government, nothing more than a construction entrepreneur. And he lacks the image of the founder of a school. Completely the antithesis of pure Zen, what pure Zen is supposed to represent, this kind of fixation, fascination, or devotion to spiritual purity. You know, why someone who's kind of obviously currying favor with the establishment in order to further his aims and goals. So I'm a little wary of the time here, so I'm going to maybe pick up the pace here a little bit. The main point is that, you know, I think for many people studying the Zen tradition and studying Eisai, they look at Eisai very much in the Japanese context, and they understand him in relationship to that. What I've done here, and I'm not going to spend much time, but my main point is that if you look back to the Chinese context, that Eisai and Dogen and many other of the Japanese Buddhist pilgrims who went to China they studied through the institutional framework of the Five Mountains system that demanded regularity of conventional monastic practice. And particularly, I focus on a figure here, Mian Shinja, who was a prominent abbot at the monastery in the years prior to Eisai's arrival, and his large impact on Japanese Zen. Here's his lineage here, and I'm just going to point out very briefly, Yuanwu Kechin. This belongs to the Linji lineage, by the way. And Yuanwu Keqin was the teacher of Dahui Tsonggao, who introduced the practice of Kan Huatou, or koan practice, as the best technique for realizing enlightenment. Yuanwu Keqin wrote the Blue Cliff Records, or compiled the Blue Cliff Records. So these are very much kind of mainstream figures. So Mian Shinja, he had great knowledge, we can only suppose, of this, what is often regarded as the central and maybe the only Linji tradition that came out of Southern Song Dynasty, China. But if we look at the depiction of the Mian Shinja's teaching, he said that he characterized Bodhidharma's teaching in terms of the three slogans, but makes no mention of a separate transmission outside the teachings. And also, he even says, while the tenets of Linji teaching go straight to the origins and do not indulge in stages, and the stick and the shout are employed equally in the marvelous functioning of enlightened nature, they may result in excesses if not tempered by conventional Buddhist teaching and instruction. And the erroneous followers of Linji's teachings can't avoid accepting falsehoods and trusting in imitations. They mistakenly think that apprehending the key phrase, the Huatou, or this is like the koan tradition in Japan, exempts them from the law of cause and effect, and they produce great self-pride and succumb to depraved views, but are completely unaware of it. And as a result, the author of this record, it's the tomb inscription for Mian Shinja, he says there's need for masters like Mian who understand this situation clearly. In other words, who do not give precedence to Huatou realization at the expense of conventional Buddhist practice. So I'm thinking that this is more of a reflection of the reality of what was going on, this kind of mixed practice, if you will, that was going on during the Southern Song Five Mountains Buddhist establishment. Now, I'm going to go through this next part. I'm just going to mention it. It's here in the record, but Mian Shinja, as I said, he had influence in Japan. He's, through his students, he produced a number of lineages. Okay, here's the first one through his students that goes to Japan. Then we get a second one, Lan Shi Daolong as a student. So these reflect Japanese monks who came and studied in the tradition of Mian Shinja through his students, or whose students sent their own students to Japan, Chinese emigre masters going to Japan. So it represents both. And then we have Ujun Shirfan, one of the descendants of Mian, whose influence can't not be emphasized enough. He produced 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lineages in Japan. And these are very important figures in the Japanese Zen context during the Kamakura period. So, and then also we have the fourth one, the last one here. But my point here is that, rather than looking at Eisai's mixed practice, syncretic Zen, as an aberration, I'm arguing that he represents the mainstream and that he comes from this kind of mainstream tradition. So now to kind of wind things up here, so to give you a chance to ask me some questions, my final remarks. As I said before, there is no such thing as pure Zen outside its modern imagination. The construct created is a construct created in response to a Protestant Buddhist paradigm, and as a way to redeem Japan's cultural legacy against the onslaught of cultural colonialism. So that's my first point. The second point is that syncretic Zen is the only viable model for Zen studies. Since no Zen teaching is quote unquote pure, there are only varying degrees and different types of syncretism. The third point, validating Chan and Son in their own terms, instead of in the past, and this is what is occurring, that in the past, Chan and Son, the Chinese Chan, Korean Son traditions were very much appreciated and interpreted through the eyes of Japanese Zen, particularly modern Zen, which emphasized those aspects which coincided with this Japanese Zen orthodoxy. So that's one of the things that we find that is going on and needs to continue. And we obviously, the point forward, we need to revalidate syncretic Zen as the mainstream tradition in Japan. So my proposal is that we should assume that every Chan, Son, and Zen figure is a syncretist. The only question is to what degree. They're not all syncretisms are the same. In fact, they're all different, sometimes remarkably so. So we need to look at what is the nature of the syncretism. What kind of syncretism is espoused? Why is it espoused? How is it espoused? And this will get us into the question of historical context and what was valued at the time and why this syncretism made sense to the people who proposed it at the time. Just as one might argue that the kind of quote unquote pure Zen makes sense in the modern context as a response to the conditions of its time. So, and also I'll end with my a plug here for, because in a sense, in an attempt to practice what I'm preaching, I held a workshop or a conference some years ago at the University of Arizona, which led to this volume, Approaches to Chan, Son, and Zen Studies, Chinese Chan Buddhism and its Spread Throughout East Asia, which starts to, tries to begin a template for how Zen studies, as it's called here, I've called it here, but really Chan, Son, and Zen studies can proceed, and how Zen studies, if we look at Zen studies, particularly in the context of Japan, how it needs to be reconfigured as not the tradition, but a tradition that has these other compatible traditions in Chan and Son. So I will leave it here with just something that I picked up at the, I've translated the contents of this Rinzai School Daily Sutra Readings, a little booklet. I picked it up from the Ryoanji Temple in Kyoto, a major temple associated with the Rinzai Zen tradition, last summer when I was in Japan. And I'm going just through the contents, and I won't go through all of them, but I think it reveals beyond any doubt how syncretic the Rinzai Zen tradition is in practice. Because what we see is, what we might say is a lot of very, very conventional readings from Buddhist sources. The only thing I've emphasized in red, we have the Japanese hymns for Zen Master Hakuin. So there is a nod to the Japanese Zen tradition, which seems only appropriate, but it's certainly not overwhelming. In fact, one could argue that it's underwhelming. And so this is the syncretism in the Rinzai School Daily Sutra Readings Manual in Japan. I will end it there. Thank you so much for listening. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so very much, Professor Welter. That was such a lucid and engaging talk about a subject that has many intricate complications to it, both historically and ideologically. And so you made many things that, to me, I knew about in certain contexts, have a much clearer framework. So thank you very much for that. I'm sure that many other people gathered here have had their curiosity piqued by your talk and will have questions. So this is now the time that we have set aside in this event for discussion. As I mentioned at the beginning, if you'd like to ask a question, please send a chat message with your question to KF Q&A via the chat feature on Zoom. And then the KF team will relay selected questions for me to pose to our speaker. Again, there may be more questions than we're able to get to, so I apologize if we're not able to get to your question, but please do submit those. While we're waiting for some questions to be submitted, I have a few of my own, Professor Welter, if you don't mind. Something that was particularly new and different that I was not familiar with at all was the influence of this particular master Mian Shinja of Hangzhou and the different lineages that continue not only through Eisai but through other lineages into Japan. And something that what I was thinking about in this context was there's something distinctive about Hangzhou Buddhist culture in the late Song period that was we can see those particular marks in Japan. If, for instance, the influence had been from another region of China, would have Zen taken a different, institutional Zen taken a different course in Japan? I hope the question makes sense.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Thanks so much. Well, first thing I would point out is that during the Southern Song dynasty, Hangzhou was the capital of China. And of course, this makes it very important in terms of, when you look at the five mountain system, the institutional structure of Buddhism in that time, this is the institutional structure of, this is the imperial institutional structure. These monasteries are, I often say, they're part of the administrative apparatus of the government. These are government institutions. They're supported by the government. Of course, they're religious institutions as well, but the lines between the two are very much blurred, and the abbots of these institutions are very much part of the Song dynasty bureaucracy. And the reason why they're in these positions is that they can relate so well to the what ostensibly Confucian-trained administrators, that they have the skills in writing, in poetry, in administration that are valued throughout society, and they're able to kind of complement them. But if the Hangzhou region in particular, I often say to people, because oftentimes you talk about Chinese culture, and then you talk about Buddhist culture in China. And I say to people, you can't talk about Chinese culture in the Hangzhou region without talking about Buddhism. It's integral to it. So this makes it a very special region within for Buddhism in the Chinese context. There are other regions, if you go to Sichuan, for example, that also have very rich Buddhist traditions. But there are some that may rival the Hangzhou and the Jiangnan region, but I don't know that there's any that surpass. This makes it very, very, very unique. And so yeah, I hope that answers your question. I can go on, but maybe there are other things that we want to get to.
No, thank you. That's extremely helpful. Sort of building on of that. I'm also curious about this very compelling model that you've raised of this Song-Kamakura continuum, and then as opposed to this Tang-Tokugawa kind of alliance. On the first end of that, in the Song-Kamakura continuum, maybe particularly there might be some folks in the audience who aren't as familiar with studies of what happened in Japanese Buddhism writ large during the Kamakura period. How would you position what was distinct, maybe not just about Eisai, but other people who were coming out of certain Chan lineages, particularly Chan lineages, with respect to what Honen or Shinran or Dogen or other kinds of what we now think of founders of schools of that period?
Yeah, thank you. That's also a good question, because usually the textbooks, when they write about Kamakura Zen and why it was important, they talk about how the kind of like Zen principles and the samurai spirit, and how they spoke to each other. I think that's completely wrong. That what attracted the samurai class, and particularly the elite in the samurai class, was that it was bringing this new culture from China to Japan. There had not been official diplomatic missions between China and Japan for 150 years before. So what had happened was a kind of revelation to them in the interim. And as I mean, this was a kind of a cultural transformation. And since Chan Buddhism in the Song dynasty had risen to such a high status within society that it was supported by the government, this was kind of a new model. And it was particularly attractive to the samurai because, as I said, they were, we might say they felt culturally inferior to the aristocrats, to the imperial family, right? This was the transition from Heian to Kamakura is a transition away from the power that the aristocrats wielded toward the samurai class, assuming ultimate power. Kamakura was it's a city in Japan, south of Tokyo, but it was, on the eastern frontier, and it was thought to be culturally inferior, as were its inhabitants, to the people who had been Kyoto, the elite who had been there for hundreds of years and had developed this very sophisticated culture, replete with ritual and so on. They preferred Shingon and Tendai Buddhism, the establishment Buddhism of the Heian period, which were very rich in ritual and so forth. Interestingly, Eisai was very much trained in that tradition, so he knew how to play that card as well. And this is what the samurai rulers were looking for, something that, on the one hand, they wanted to get out under the kind of the religious authority of Tendai Buddhism, the aristocratic form of Buddhism. So the fact that Zen came on the scene, it represented something new and different, but also they could argue that it represented something superior, a new superior form of culture. That's really what attracted, I think, the new people. And as the superiority of the culture took hold, even the aristocrats had to acknowledge that this kind of new cultural forms that were coming in from China that could augment what was in Japan at the time. I'm sorry if I got a little bit too much in the weeds there, but
no, thank you. That was extremely helpful to draw those themes out. And we have, again, a number of questions that are popping in now. And one that's sort of taking off from this question of syncretism and thinking about, as you raised it in the question of Eisai, we have one listener, Robert Colin, who's written in asking, can you please elucidate what is exactly meant by syncretism in this context? It's usually understood as between two or more mythic religious expressions, like worshiping deity A with the attributes of deity B. In your case, is it syncretic in terms of borrowed practices, borrowed texts, borrowed philosophical interpretations inside of Chan lineages, or more broadly, is it Chan or Zen taking in Huayan, Jingtu, Tiantai doctrines with a Chan or Zen twist?
Yes, it's very much the latter. It's in this context, it's really much, it's the acceptance and of the validity of the rest of the Buddhist tradition, right? And because this was what's at stake with pure Zen, this idea of pure Zen, is that that somehow they've superseded this tradition. I'll come back here to the analogy that they use. It's in the Koan collection, and it's the famous flower sermon that Ananda holds up, or the Buddha holds up on a flower at the at his sermon, doesn't say anything, and one of his disciples, Mahakashyapa, smiles, and this begins what is alleged to be the mind-to-mind transition between the Buddha and Mahakashyapa. And the Chan and Zen tradition, they create this linkage all the way back to that. But in actual fact, they acknowledge that there are two transmissions. There's this mind-to-mind transmission. There's also the textual transmission that came through Ananda, the Buddha's disciple. So oftentimes, if you go to Chan or Zen monasteries, the main figure, they'll have Shakyamuni Buddha in the middle, and they'll have Ananda on one side, Mahakashyapa in the other, to acknowledge that both of these traditions are there. Now, the question is, well, how do you understand these two traditions in relationship to each other? And in the pure Zen tradition, there's a tendency to try and negate the validity of the textual in its more radical form, which we see often in the Rinzai, Linji, and so on and so forth. It's kind of like, you burn the sutras, you burn the statues of the Buddha. These are impediments to enlightenment if you invoke these. But I think a more compatible version exists that, on the one hand, you can also accept this tradition, and maybe many Zen people would, but as a prelude to the greater tradition of Zen, or you can kind of accept them as more or less equal, but just different expressions. As I like to quote Tsongmi and Yongming Yensho, that they both originated from Shakyamuni, right? So it's not as if how can you undermine Shakyamuni's teaching? His textual teachings. They're also a legitimate expression of them. So when I use the word syncretism, I use it in this kind of way of kind of accommodating the other aspects of the Buddhist tradition. And that's why I say at the end, it's really, if we assume that everybody is a syncretist to some extent, the question is how and why, and what are they. Some people may accommodate Huayan, some people the Lotus Sutra. It can vary a lot from master to master and circumstance to circumstance. But you see, in some ways, I don't like using the word syncretism, because syncretism has, it has a kind of pejorative meaning, given the Protestant Christian orientations, that syncretism wasn't the, syncretism was the kind of teaching of pre-Protestant Christianity, that it absorbed all of these other kinds of elements. And so when we retrieve the term syncretism, we also have to disavow it of its kind of negative connotations that often come through the Christian tradition.
Yes, that dimension is quite fascinating. You may be aware there's a quite robust debate within the sphere of Theravada studies around the use and applicability of a term like syncretism. Some like Justin McDaniel or Patana Kitiasa saying that it's not appropriate to use on the one hand, and others like Kanya Watanakun suggesting that yes, this is actually an extremely appropriate term if we delimit it from its particular kind of context. Your response there is also related to a number of questions that have come in regarding this question of transmission. And just to frame these, is some questions coming in from Lisa Kluczynski and Roger Graves. In this sort of golden age of Zen studies that you mentioned in your talk, part of what happened, as far as I understand it, was a deconstruction of some of the rhetoric around the early Zen lineages, going back to some mythical origin of the tradition in China. And a lot of the way that Zen is presented is in terms of this transmission of a kind of, as Lisa writes, as the transmission of Chan Zen as a monolithic entity. On the other hand, you're showing that in focusing on the syncretistic dimensions, it also allows us to think about this question of tracing, as she writes, the transmission and transformation of elements of, say, Song Buddhist culture, etc. What do you think is at stake in the arguments you've made in terms of how this question of transmission is thought about in the study of Zen?
I'm not sure I quite understand the question. If we're talking about, because there's kind of Chan Zen transmission, which is kind of a religious construct, but there's also cultural transmission from Song China to Kamakura, Japan. So are you asking me to kind of talk about the relationship between?
My understanding is the question is about these two different kinds of transmission. How do we think about them in relationship to one another?
Yeah, it's interesting because, personally, I'm not so interested in the religious transmission. Of course, I have to be because I'm studying Chan and Zen, and they kind of try to make a big deal of it. And of course, in the case of Eisai, some people may know that prior to Eisai going to China and getting the transmission, there was Nonin. There was a Japanese figure called Nonin who tried to usurp the banner of Zen without going to China himself. He sent a couple of his disciples, Dainichi Nonin, sent a couple of his disciples to Japan, and they, in a sense, picked it up, transmission by proxy. And he brought it back, and Eisai called foul. You can't do that. It has to be, in order for the transmission to occur, it has to be mind to mind or person to person. However, we know that there are many instances in the Chan Zen and even the Song tradition. And somebody pointed out to me recently that Jinul, for example, never went to China, never actually received transmission, but he became the major figure, the proponent of this, what I would call, this combined Kyo-Son amalgamation, which is this kind of what I'm calling syncretism, this syncretistic model. But the thing that's probably more important for Eisai was the cultural transmissions. He brought, as is well established and he's well regarded for it, he brought tea, matcha tea, powdered tea. And of course, so he's really, in Japan today, he's regarded for that as much as, any kind of religious transition. He also brought branches of the Bodhi tree from China to Japan and planted them around in other areas, in certain kind of areas. But the main thing is he brought the model of the Gozan, the 5 monastery system with him, the idea of it. So he became back and he was an institution builder. He built a first monastery in Kyushu, then he built one in Kamakura, and then finally he built one in Kyoto. And the ones in Kamakura and Kyoto are regarded as part of the respective 5 mountains institutional systems in Kamakura and Kyoto. So, I think in some sense he brought this kind of structure of how of a Buddhist institutional framework that can better society. You have to remember, Eisai went to Japan. They believed they were in the Mappo, the end of the era. The Buddhism was in serious decline. Japanese society was under warfare, the end of the Heian. So things did not look good at all. In fact, there was a lot of social and political issues were very front and center. So he brought back a structure that he brought back the structure that he saw was working in Song Dynasty China. He brought it back and he, conceived or promoted the model for conception. It was not him alone. We might say he planted the first seeds, if you will, of this structure, but it grew into something that was even a more major impact in Japan than it was in China.
Thank you. We're coming to the end of our time, so I just want to bring in one last question from the audience, and hopefully this can tie together some of the ways that you've framed out for us what both what you and your colleagues have done in this field of research and what might be possible with these new kind of frameworks going forward. So Samuel Koo asks, in your talk, you've pointed out a number of new research directions, sort of focusing on this particular framework around syncretic Zen. Do you see, along with that, any new research methods that might be needed? For example, digital humanities methods, geographic studies, any other kinds of new research methods? Or do you think the classic methods of philology, close reading, history, et cetera, are the main methods to use?
Well, I think all the methods are necessary, and particularly, I know my colleague Zhang Wu at the University of Arizona is big on the GIS and mapping and things like that, and I think he's done a lot of interesting things, him and some of his students, around Hangzhou, and I think that's very useful. But I think the big thing is that for a long time, and of course most of my career was focused on studying kind of more doctrinal kinds of texts, or canonical kinds of texts from the tradition. But I see now moving forward, and even myself, I'm into gazetteers, kind of local histories. In my recent book that you mentioned at the beginning, The Tale of Two Stupas, that's really based on gazetteer research. Something, and I think that's, and the Mian Shinja, what I brought out in him as a kind of I think a very potent example of the alternate view, and what I would call the mainstream view that has been hidden. This information comes out of a tomb inscription that somebody wrote about him. It's not a kind of a doctrinal text. So I think, yes, we need to do as much as we can to look at other kinds of sources. And I mean, as many people may know, this is one of the things that the Chinese and Japanese context, they were wonderful record keepers, and so we have not only Buddhist texts, but we have what we might call secular, quote unquote, texts that are very revelatory to kind of contextualize what's going on and broaden what's going on in the Buddhist context. Thank you.
Well, with that, I just wanted to thank you, everyone who was here, for asking your questions. I'm sorry that we didn't get a chance for everything that you all asked. But especially thank you, Professor Welter, for your engaging responses, for this wonderful talk. I feel really fortunate that I had this chance to spend this time with you all today.
Well, thank you very much, Trent. I really appreciate it. And my appreciation extends far and wide to the Kensei Foundation, who have been so supportive, not only of my own research, but so many other wonderful kinds of research and other kinds of projects. So I can't thank them enough.
Thank you. So for everyone, I just want to let you know that we'll resume this series, the Goodman Lectures, in January. We have a very exciting lineup for 2024, so stay tuned for further updates. As always, to stay in touch about upcoming events, visit kenseifoundation.org/events, as well as kenseifoundation.org/story/series/Goodman Lecture Series, both to discover previous events in this series as well as ones that will be coming up. So thank you again, all of you, for joining us. We hope we'll have a chance to see you again soon. May you all be safe and well.
Thank you.